Hey, what's good? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Troy Mayers and I am pumped to have you here. In this video, we're going to explore the Canon R7's potential as a BCam to the Canon C70. Let's get after it. I want to open this up with a little bit of a disclaimer in that technically the best BCam to the C70 is another C70. And this applies to any multicam production, whatever the A cam that you're using is. By all technicality, a duplicate camera is going to be the best BCam. And there's a couple of reasons as to why that is. The first one is going to be a dynamic range comparison. Those two are going to match up identically if you have a duplicate camera. And by extension of that, the color information as well, the color profiles that you shoot in, the color science between different brands are different, so having duplicate helps there, as well as the logarithmic curve that you choose to shoot in. If you're shooting C-Log2, C-Log3, if you're shooting in RAW, you can get matching log curves as well between duplicate cameras. And then also on the sensor side of things, you get the similar field of view as well as exposure. If you're trying to mix full frame and Super 35 sensors, you're getting different fields of view and you're also exposing your image differently. So having duplicate cameras makes things simpler in the image acquisition aspect of things in that everything matches right out of the gate. However, there are going to be a handful of us, and myself included, that don't necessarily want a duplicate camera body. And there's plenty of reasons as to why you might feel that way. And one of the first considerations for me is going to be the size. I am a minimalist filmmaker, or at least I'm trying to be more and more of a minimalist filmmaker. The contradiction is that I love gear. So that's kind of the internal struggle for me. But with that, I'm trying to fit my entire production kit into one bag. So size is going to be important. The C70 is a very compact cinema camera on its own, but not as compact as something like the R7. And there's some really incredible technology being packed into cameras that are this size. So it's worth taking into consideration for your workflow, the overall size of things. The next consideration here is going to be the price. The C70 comes in at $5,500 and some change with tax, depending where you're at. That's nothing to scoff at. That's a lot of money to pay for a camera. So like I mentioned earlier, some of these smaller cameras have some incredible capabilities. And with that, some drastically reduced prices. The R7 comes in at $1,500 US dollars for the body only, which is great. That really helps the pocketbook and makes it possible to have a second camera that isn't necessarily a duplicate to my C70. And by extension of the lower price, I also find that I'm more inclined to use my R7 as a crash cam. I'm not as afraid to stick this in places that it maybe shouldn't be. I'm willing to take more creative risks with my R7 because it doesn't cost as much, right? If something were to go wrong, I'm not losing $6,000 out of my C70. I'm only going to be out $1,500, and I could swallow that a lot easier than I could losing a C70. So it helps me to push creative boundaries, having a BCam that I'm willing to take more chances with. And the final reason I'll mention today as to why it might be worth not having a duplicate BCam, and this is probably a really important one for a lot of us, and that's going to be the added functionality that it could give us. The C70, it's built from the ground up to be a cinema camera. It's video first, which means it's not taking any photos. I know there's a photo mode. You could take a still or essentially a screenshot of your sensor, but it's not designed to take photos. So something like the R7 here is much more of a true hybrid, and given the ability that we can set it to photo mode and take photos as another real benefit to having something like this as a BCam as opposed to just a duplicate. So we're left here trying to balance these two lists, trying to get this scale to even out. And the ultimate question is, how does the R7 stack up as a BCam to the C70? Well, let's rig this up on a tripod and find out. And just like that, we have a multicam production. If only it was ever that easy, right? So now we have the Canon C70 set up as our A camera, and the BCam is the R7. This will give you the opportunity to see how the two cut together while we go through some of the information and specs about this duo. I have already done a full video on the R7 kind of as a standalone camera, so you can check that out. I'm going to link that on the screen that you're seeing now, as well as in the description below. I mentioned at the onset of the video that technically a duplicate camera is the best B camera for a few reasons, and one of them was dynamic range. And dynamic range is definitely a discrepancy between the R7 and the Canon C70. On the C70, we are getting that Super 35 DGO dual gain output sensor that we've kind of robbed and been able to pull down from the C300 Mark II, Mark III line of cameras and repackaged it into the C70 body. And that DGO sensor is where a lot of the price discrepancy comes from, right? It is an incredible sensor that gives us 16 plus stops of dynamic range, which is wild. The R7, on the other hand, it's got a more traditional hybrid style CMOS sensor, which is going to give us right about 11 stops of dynamic range. So that is, not sugarcoating it, quite the discrepancy between the two. So it'll be kind of up to you to decide how big of a factor that is in your production workflow. We do have a small discrepancy in the color profiles. The Canon C70 is able to shoot in C-Log 2, and the R7 is only capable of C-Log 3. C-Log 2 unlocks that greater dynamic range capable of the DGO sensor that we just can't get out of the R7. So there is a bit of a discrepancy there. And the kind of workaround, and here's what I do with my cameras when I have them running side by side, is I drop the Canon C70 into C-Log 3. So that way they're both shooting in the same logarithmic profile. And the other benefit of having a true duplicate camera was going to be the field of view and the exposure considerations between two different cameras. And the great part here about the C70 and the R7 as a duo is that they both have the same field of view. They both have a cropped Super 35 sensor. So that means we're getting the same field of view between matching lenses, and we're also going to get the same exposure when we're at the same f-stop or t-stop, depending on the lenses you're using. I also mentioned that I didn't necessarily want a duplicate C70 as a BCam, and I had a couple reasons as to why. So what is the R7 bringing to the table that a duplicate C70 wouldn't? And the first one is going to be the size considerations. By choosing to go with an R7 instead of a Canon C70, I am able to actually fit both of my camera bodies with lenses into one bag, as well as a couple of other additional accessories. That is huge. That carries a lot of weight in my decision-making. That might not carry as much weight in your decision-making, but for me, that's a big factor as to why I went with the R7 over, say, even an R3, which is, again, even taller, and it wouldn't fit in my current bag configuration. I'd have to rework something or get a different bag. So I love the R7 for its size, but that also provides a couple of drawbacks when you drop down in size. And one of them is going to be, we're getting less robust input and output ports on the R7. We do only get micro HDMI out, which is not super usable on a professional level. We also only get 3.5 millimeter in, which works out fine in my workflow because I use a tentacle sync to sync these two cameras together. So that's all the more that I really need, but we're not getting the XLRs that we get on the Canon C70, and the 3.5 millimeter input is much less of a professional input. It doesn't allow the use of XLR microphones, which are some of the best microphones on the market. There are some great 3.5 mics, so we can make it work. There's workarounds, but that's just it. They're workarounds. The next consideration was going to be the price. The R7 comes in at $1,500. I didn't want to spend another $6,000 to get a second C70. That's an extra almost $5,000 that I saved. I can reinvest into mics or lights or maybe some tattoos at Andrew Wilson coming your way. The other aspect is going to be the functionality of the R7 that I don't always get with the C70, and one of them is going to be gimbal use. I often want to stick a camera on a gimbal, and sure, the C70 is capable of fitting on my RS2, fits even better on an RS3, but it's a heavier setup. And at the end of the day, ounces equal pounds and pounds equal pain, right? And you're holding that, for most of us, are hand holding it, or we got two hand setups that we're using, and that's taxing the heavier that it gets. So I've really enjoyed having a much smaller and lighter BCam in the R7 to stick on my gimbals for those types of shots. It's been a much more enjoyable experience than lugging around my C70 on the RS2. The other functionality of the R7 we didn't get on the C70 is the photo capability. And it's got a great 32 megapixel sensor, which is even on the higher end of Super 35 size sensor megapixel counts. So oftentimes these cropped sensors have more of like a 20-ish megapixel count. So we're getting 32 megapixels here, which makes this really great for photos. You get nice sharp resolutions and you're getting a lot of megapixel information because it's shooting 32 megapixel RAWs. We don't get that on the C70. So I love being able to fill that void with my BCam that a duplicate C70 wouldn't be able to fill. All right, so now we're looking at these two cameras side by side. And if you're anything like me, when you're trying to decide which BCam will be the best complement to your A-cam, the first question, and maybe the most important one, is how well is the footage going to cut together? Is it going to provide a seamless experience for your viewers when you cut back and forth, or is it going to be disruptive and jarring and noticeable? So that's the question, and hopefully with this side-by-side comparison, you can see just how well the Canon C70 and the R7 are going to cut together. So right now, we're looking at the log image coming out of both. We're shooting in 4K, 30 frames a second, in C-Log 3, in XF-AVC long gap on the Canon C70. On the R7, we're shooting in 4K at 30 frames per second, C-Log 3 in the MP4 format. So they are as matching of codecs as I could possibly make them. So this is what you're seeing straight out of camera. This is the log footage when you drop it on your timeline. Now I'm going to wipe a grade over both of these images simultaneously, and now you're going to be seeing a C-Log 3 to Rec. 709 color space transform using Davinci Resolve's color management. So this is what that Rec. 709 conversion is going to look like. If you do nothing else to match these together, this is what you get. All right, let's bring it back to normal for my final thoughts on this duo, okay? I'm gonna start with some of the negatives first, that way we can end on a positive. The first negative I have with the duo is the lacking I/O ports. We've got the smaller body and less robust ports. That is not something I'm super pumped about. I don't like having to use 3.5 millimeter audio ports. More specifically, I don't like using micro SD ports. So that's a bit of a bummer and just part of the trade-off that I wanted to make clear. The other negative worth mentioning about this setup is the fact that I have to use C-Log 3 on the Canon C70 to better match the R7. That's always a bit of a bummer. That's not something I'm super pumped about, having to drop the quality and dynamic range from C-Log 2 that I could shoot on the C70 to C-Log 3 in order to better match the R7. That's just one of the things you have to deal with when you run a multicam production with different cameras. You don't have a duplicate camera setup. You always have to grade down to whatever the lowest quality image is. You can't bring a low quality image up to the specs of a high quality. You've got to go the other way around. So I have to switch from C-Log 2 to C-Log 3 to make that happen. But as a result, I get a better matching image. And I think that's worthwhile, at least in my opinion. I don't think that we're losing too terribly much in that switch from C-Log 2 to C-Log 3. And like I mentioned, the better match, I think, is more important to the grand scheme, the overall scope of the project, than it is to have just a little bit better dynamic range. So I think it's worthwhile, but it's a trade-off nonetheless. There are plenty of positives though, and I think the first thing worth noting is that the best camera that you can use is the one that you have. And the fact that the size of the R7 allows me to bring both of my cameras with me in just one bag means that I have two incredible cameras to use on any of my productions. If I was using two C70s, there might be times where the second C70 body gets left in the studio and then I don't have it with me. So based on that alone, I think it's worthwhile to have these two for my production in one bag. The size is great. Another positive of these two cameras is they both have native RF mounts, which means I can use all of my full frame RF glass interchangeably between these two cameras. If nothing else, I am a huge fanboy of the RF lens. If it's not Canon, it's because of the RF lenses. I am pumped about the lenses they already have on the market, and I'm even more excited about the ones that are in the pipeline and on the Canon roadmap. I think there's some great tech there and worth building my production around. So the RF compatibility, real plus when matching these two together. The other positive here is going to be the way that I can sync these two cameras together, and it's very simple thanks to the Tentacle sync system. I have syncs for both of these cameras as well as some of the Tracky actual like mic packs, and they're very small. They're very minimalist. I like that, and they're easy to use. And in the real world, they've made multicam productions with multiple audio sources possible, and simple at that. Not only possible, but simple. So these two sync up really well together. Moving on, because these are both Canon cameras, we're getting Canon's color science, which means they're at least going to be in the same ballpark. If they're not exact, they're going to be very close. The other pro that I haven't mentioned at all in this video that I think is another great aspect of these two cameras together is they use the same media cards. They both have dual UHS-2 SD card slots, which is great. I think the SD card is a great card to have. It's universally accessible. You can go to Walmart and find an SD card slot in a pinch if you needed to. And the price per gigabyte is much lower than things like CF Express type cards, things of that nature. The SD card falls into a real sweet spot in price and performance. That balances out really well. So the fact that they have the matching media card slots means I just need to buy one type of card and I can use it interchangeably between the two cameras. All right, quite the balancing act. And the question is, how does the math add up? Well, I think that the Canon R7 makes an excellent BCam to the Canon C70 and one that I plan to use into the foreseeable future. Now, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the matter, so drop down into the comments below. I'll see you down there. On your way, make sure you hit like, subscribe, do all the YouTube things. When you get a second, check out my full review of the Canon R7 as kind of a standalone camera, and I will see you in the next video.